Okay, so picture this. It's 1943. The United States Marine Corps, an institution not exactly famous for flexibility, decides it needs a new fighter squadron to fight in the Pacific. And it needs it fast. The problem, they're a little short on experienced pilots. But what they do have is a collection of guys nobody else wanted. Pilots who'd been bounced from other units, guys with disciplinary records, guys who drank too much, they fought too much, and generally made their commanding officers probably want to lie down and press a cold cloth on their foreheads. And to lead this motley assemblage of military misfits, they chose, and I use the word chose pretty loosely here, a man who was simultaneously one of the greatest combat pilots who's ever lived and a complete and total disaster of a human being. His name was Gregory Pappy Boyington, and this is his story. Good luck to us all. Welcome to Archives and Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. And this week is a pretty interesting podcast. I took a side turn. I was doing some research on fighter planes and the evolution of fighter planes, and I ended up finding the Corsair F4U. And it was famously used in World War II as an advanced fighter. And it got me thinking about this show that I used to watch, which was called Black Sheep Squadron. As YouTube's algorithm sometimes does, I ended up seeing a couple clips. So I started thinking, well, how does this group actually get formed in the Pacific? Because in the show, they were a bunch of misfits. It was a lot of drinking and fighting, as I was just talking about. And I really loved the show. I loved the planes the most. I had models, of course, as a kid, and I would hang up Corsair F4Us, I would hang up Japanese Zeros, and they would have battle damage. I even actually had an RC plane that I tried to get going that was a Corsair F4U, but I never actually got it going, but I was still obsessed with those planes. I started looking into Pappy Boyington's story and how Black Sheep Squadron got put together, and so this is going to be the story. Again, I'm your host, James Coulon, for Archives and Anchovies. Today, we're talking about VMF-214, the Black Sheep Squadron, and the absolutely unhinged saga of their commanding officer, Major Gregory Boyington. This episode, it's going to feature dogfights, bar brawls, a Japanese prison camp, a Medal of Honor, a TV show, a memoir, and probably enough whiskey to float a whole destroyer in. So strap in. And let's start at the beginning. Gregory Boyington was born in 1912 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is coincidentally a place that kind of sounds like it was named by someone who had had a few drinks. He grew up in a chaotic family situation. He later discovered that the man he thought was his father wasn't his father at all, and carried that particular piece of emotional baggage with him for the rest of his life, and primarily in the form, among other things, a prodigious capacity to drink alcohol. He was, by most accounts, a brilliant man. He graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in aeronautical engineering. That's pretty impressive. He was also a champion wrestler. He joined the Marine Corps and became a flight instructor. So on paper, his resume was extremely impressive. Off paper, it was catastrophic. By the time the war started, Boyington had managed to accumulate a string of personal and financial disasters that would make a soap opera writer say, hey, we probably should dial this back a little. It's not very realistic. He had multiple marriages, staggering debts, a reputation in the Marines for being difficult, which in the Marine Corps takes quite a bit of doing, and he owed back child support. In fact, he owed money to seemingly everyone he'd met. So in 1941, he made a decision that seemed logical at the time. He resigned his Marine Corps commission and went to go fly for the American Volunteer Group in China. You may know this group better as the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers were this wild, semi-mercenary outfit organized by Claire Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer who'd become an aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese government. Chennault had been trying to get Americans to pay attention to Japanese aggression in China for years. And when they went nowhere officially, he basically built his own air force. The American Volunteer Group, their actual name, was recruited quietly from U.S. military ranks prior to Pearl Harbor, which put everyone involved in a legally gray area that the Roosevelt administration was very careful not to look at too directly, even though it was authorized. The pilots were technically civilians. They wore Chinese nationalist uniforms, and they flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. At the time, it was not the best fighter in the world by any stretch, but what Chanel had developed, he had developed specific tactics that made those aircraft genuinely deadly against the Japanese aircraft. You probably know the famous shark teeth painted on the nose of those P-40s. That is an iconic image, and it basically is shorthand for World War II aviation at that point. The Flying Tigers looked like they'd been designed by a Hollywood art department, and they also performed like that, too. Against the Japanese Army Air Force over Burma and China, they were extraordinarily effective for the size of the force. And the pay structure, as I mentioned, was genuinely insane. $500 per confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. In 1941, that's a lot of money. That's roughly $9,000 today with inflation per plane. You're literally being paid to be more aggressive in combat, which for a group that already included Pappy Boyington, that required no additional encouragement. Boyington, he fit right in. He flew with the Flying Tigers from late 1941 into 1942, and he claimed 6 aerial victories, which is important because the term claimed is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, as we'll get to later on in this episode. And then he had a spectacular falling out with the organization over money, surprisingly over his conduct, and the general fact that he was Gregory Boyington. He came back to the United States flat broke, massively in debt, and without a commission. The Marines, showing either tremendous institutional memory or absolutely none at all, allowed him to rejoin, eventually also restoring his rank as a major. It was 1943. The Pacific War was kind of grinding on at this point, and Boyington was about to get his squadron. So here's how the Black Sheep were born. And it's structurally one of my favorite origin stories that I've researched so far in military history. So it was really neat to read all about this. Boyington was Espiritu Santo, a base in the North Hebrides, which is now Vanuatu. It was the summer of 1943, and he wanted a command and didn't have one. What he did have was a pool of replacement pilots who had arrived in theater without assignments and a collection of F-4U Corsairs. These were excellent planes, and they were just sitting around not being used. Now, most officers at this point would have gone through proper channels, filed requests, and waited. Boyington, instead, went to his commanding officer, General Ralph Mitchell, and essentially proposed that he'd be given the leftover pilots and the spare planes and allowed to form a squadron on the spot. And Mitchell, and I genuinely admire this man for this, said yes. So that's VMF-214. It was assembled in about 2 weeks from pilots nobody had formally assigned anywhere and aircraft that were technically spares. It had no formal lineage, no distinguished history, no traditions. What it had was Pappy Boyington, who was 30 years old, had the face and energy of someone who'd packed 60 years of living into only 3 decades through sheer aggressive personal decision-making. The younger pilots called him Pappy, and he embraced it. The pilots themselves were a remarkable collection. Some were genuinely green, fresh from training. Others had been bounced from other squadrons for various infractions. A few were simply guys who ended up in the replacement pool by bureaucratic accident. Boyington's approach to unit cohesion was, let's say, unconventional. He took them to a bar. He got them all drunk together. He told them they were going to be the best fighter squadron in the Pacific. And he told them that nobody else wanted them, and that was fine because they didn't need anybody else. This is the kind of leadership speech that absolutely should not work, and yet there's something almost beautiful about the logic of it. You've assembled a group of men who've already been told implicitly or explicitly that they're just not good enough. And instead of trying to overcome that narrative, Boyington leaned into it. You're the outcasts? Great. That's your identity now. Let's own it. They named themselves the Black Sheep on their own initiative because that's who they were. The Black Sheep's combat record, especially for how quickly they were put together, is genuinely extraordinary. Their main theater of operations was the Solomon Islands campaign, specifically the push towards Rabaul, the massive Japanese base on the island of New Britain that served as the keystone of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. The strategy was to neutralize Rabaul, and the Black Sheep were part of that effort in a very direct way. They flew escort missions, they flew sweeps, and they got into an enormous number of dogfights. In their first combat tour, which lasted about 6 weeks, the squadron officially claimed around 57 enemy aircraft destroyed. That is an insane number for 6 weeks of operations. Now, as historians will note, aerial victory claims in World War II were often inflated, not through deliberate dishonesty necessarily, but because there's chaos in a dogfight. Multiple pilots might see the same plane go down and each claim it because they each genuinely believe they're the ones who shot it down. So the actual number is probably somewhat lower, but even accounting for that, their operational effectiveness was absolutely remarkable. Boyington himself was on a personal mission. Here's where the numbers get complicated and also pretty interesting. At the time, Boyington was flying with the Black Sheep. The record for the highest scoring American fighter ace in the war was held by Joe Foss, also a Marine, with 26 aerial victories. A quick sidebar here because the term ace is something we've all heard, and if you remember, Snoopy was even an ace. And it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, and it's worth being precise about what that actually meant. An ace was a pilot that was credited for 5 or more aerial victories, meaning 5 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. The number 5 actually goes back to World War I, when the French first started using it as a benchmark, and it stuck across both wars and almost all of the air forces. 5 sounds almost modest when you're talking about guys like Foss or Boyington, but consider this. The vast majority of combat pilots, brave, trained, super capable men who flew their missions, never shot down single enemy aircraft. Air-to-air combat is chaotic, it's fast, and genuinely terrifying. And most kills came from a relatively small number of pilots who had a particular gift for it. Getting to 5 was a genuine distinction. Getting to 26, like Foss, put you in a category so rarefied it barely had a name. So when we talk about Boyington chasing that record, understand that he was chasing essentially the ceiling of human performance in aerial combat. Boyington was publicly, loudly, aggressively going after that record. He also claimed those 6 victories from his Flying Tiger days. So the problem is that the Flying Tigers records are genuinely murky, and there's real historical debate about whether those kills should count, whether they were verified, and so on. So the Marine Corps officially credited him with only 22 victories, which would still make him one of the top aces of the war. But Boyington maintained to his dying day that the 6 Flying Tiger kills were real, and his total was 28, which would beat Foss. One thing to note about these aerial victories or the kill counts is I'm only talking about the Marine Corps pilots here. There were, of course, aces in the other branches in the military, in the Navy, and of course in the Air Force, and some of them did have higher kill counts than these 2 gentlemen, but for the purposes of this conversation, really just talking about Foss and Boyington and what Boyington was chasing. Historians have gone back and forth on this for decades, and in the research I did, I couldn't figure it out either. The short version is nobody can prove it either way. The records are incomplete, and Boyington was, famously, not someone whose self-reporting you could really take at face value. But here's the thing. Whether it's 22 kills or 28 kills, the guy could fly. His pilots trusted him. He had the ability to spot an enemy aircraft before anyone else, to position his squadron advantageously, and to, when the moment came, be downright lethal. He was absolutely reckless in ways that routinely terrified his ground crews and concerned his superior officers. I want to share a moment that I think captures Boyington perfectly. At some point during the campaign, he got on the radio and, in full violation of basically every protocol, challenged Japanese pilots to come up and fight him. Just blatantly called them out. Over the radio, by name, more or less. Come up and face us. This is definitely not standard USMC doctrine. This is not something covered in any tactical manual. This is just Pappy Boyington being Pappy Boyington, probably drunk on maybe whiskey and adrenaline, and absolutely convinced of his own invincibility, and in possession of a personality that simply could not be contained by the normal structures of military aviation. So did the Japanese pilots respond? Accounts vary, but the image of a Marine major on the radio in the Pacific essentially saying, "Hey, come at me," into the ether is one of the great unhinged moments of World War II, and I won't hear otherwise. That's just insane. And then, unfortunately, there was a day that it all went wrong for Pappy Boyington. The Black Sheep They were on a mission over Rabaul, January 3rd, 1944, and it was a big mission. A sweep to draw out Japanese fighters and escort bombers. The fighting was fierce. By this point, the Japanese were well aware the Rabaul was under serious threat and were defending it heavily, and they were defending it hard. In the chaos of the engagement, Boyington's Corsair was hit. Accounts differ on exactly what happened. There were other American pilots nearby, and the action was so intense that they couldn't really figure it out. But what is clear is that Boyington went down into the water somewhere near Rabaul. His squadron searched. They saw no parachute, no raft, no signal. Gregory Boyington was reported missing in action, then eventually he was presumed dead. The Marine Corps posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor. There were ceremonies, his mother received the award, and he was mourned. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Boyington, he wasn't dead. Boyington had survived being shot down. He'd been picked up from the water, not by the Americans, unfortunately, but by a Japanese submarine. He spent the next 20 months as a prisoner of war. And this is where the story gets somehow even more complicated, because Boyington's captivity was brutal. The Japanese had a particular interest in him because of his reputation. Enemy aces were a known quantity, and the Japanese were aware of the Black Sheep entirely. He was interrogated, he was beaten, he experienced conditions that no one should have to experience. He also, and this is both admirable and very on brand for Boyington, managed to continue being Gregory Boyington even in captivity. There are accounts of him attempting to maintain his dignity in ways both large and small, of his sardonic humor in the face of genuinely terrible circumstances, of his fundamental refusal to be broken even when physically and mentally broken. He survived, but barely. He was liberated in August 1945 when the war ended. He came home to find himself a Medal of Honor recipient and a national hero. He also came home, as he later acknowledged, a deeply damaged man. Boyington's post-war life is one of the stranger tales in the history of American war heroes, and it requires us to do something a little uncomfortable. Hold two things in our heads at once. The first thing to hold in your head, Gregory Boyington was genuinely brave. He was a gifted combat pilot. He led his squadron with real effectiveness. He endured captivity that would have shattered lesser men. His Medal of Honor, it was earned. The second thing, Gregory Boyington was a profoundly troubled man whose relationships with alcohol and with his own trauma made his post-war life genuinely difficult for himself and for the people around him. He struggled after the war. He married again, he drank, and he drank a lot. He had difficulty holding jobs. He was so charming and charismatic in ways that got people to like him, and then he self-destructed in ways that undid all the goodwill he earned. He's not a villainous figure. There's too much genuine complexity and too much genuine pain in his story for that kind of framing, but he also is not a simple hero. In his own memoir, he makes no effort to pretend otherwise. He wrote that memoir entitled Baba Black Sheep in 1958. I haven't had a chance to read the book. I did skim a few pages, but I haven't read it in its entirety, but it's a remarkable document. Boyington writes about himself with brutal honesty that simultaneously is refreshing and slightly alarming. He didn't spare himself. He talks about his drinking. He talks about his failures as a husband and father. He talks about the way his ego led him into bad decisions. He also claimed credit for things that other Black Sheep veterans disputed. Apparently, this book caused genuine controversy among his former pilots, some of whom felt that Boyington had elevated himself at the expense of the squadron's collective story, and that some of his accounts were just embellished. This led to one of the more unusual dynamics in military memoir history, where some of the very men who served under him and who generally admire his leadership as a pilot were also annoyed at the version of events he'd chosen to put on paper. It's messy, it's human, and it seems that that's very much a Boyington situation. Now, all of this came in culmination to what I talked about earlier, the TV show. And the TV show is a whole different animal. In 1976, NBC premiered a television show called Baba Black Sheep, which later was renamed Black Sheep Squadron. It starred Robert Conrad as Boyington, and it was, to put this gently, a very loose adaptation of the actual history. I still enjoyed the show immensely, though, and that's kind of why we have this podcast episode today. And it was like very loose, like inspired by some real names loose, maybe not even real events. The show featured the Black Sheep Squadron fighting the Japanese while also somehow finding time to rescue beautiful nurses and get into various escapades. The actual Black Sheep flying combat missions and the brutal Solomon's campaign, they just largely didn't have time for. The actual surviving Black Sheep veterans had feelings about this. I did a little bit of research and read some quotes, and some were amused, some were annoyed, some felt their service had been turned into kind of adventure serial that trivialized what they'd actually been through. There were veterans who said politely the show bore approximately zero resemblance to their experience. Robert Conrad, to his credit, apparently did a lot of research and was serious about this role. But you can be sincere and still produce something that's more Hogan's Heroes than history. And the show definitely has that kind of energy. It lasted only 2 seasons and has since acquired kind of a fond cult TV following, like some of the shows from the 70s often accumulate, because everything from that era now exists in a sort of warm, nostalgic amber, regardless of its actual quality. There's an interesting postscript to the TV show chapter as well. The show's success meant that Boyington, who was still alive in the 70s, found himself suddenly famous again. He did interviews, he appeared at events, he embraced the celebrity in the way a man who had spent decades struggling financially would naturally embrace it. When you see footage of him from that period, gray haired, older, clearly having lived a very full life in his face, he's charismatic, he's funny, he's self deprecating. He tells stories with the timing of someone who's been telling those stories at bars for 40 years, which, to be fair, he probably had been. He died in 1988 at 75 years old, which, honestly, given the life he lived, is a testament to something. Maybe stubbornness, maybe constitution, and probably a little of both. So, what do we make of all of this? So, what's the takeaway here? What does the Black Sheep Squadron actually mean historically and culturally? I think there are a few things worth pulling out. First, the actual combat story is genuinely impressive and deserves more attention than a TV show version gives it. These were men, many of them young, inexperienced, and thrown together in a matter of weeks, who flew some of the most demanding combat missions of the Pacific War and who achieved real documented results under genuinely difficult conditions. The Solomon's campaign was not a sideshow. Neutralizing that base was strategically vital. The Black Sheep were part of that effort in a strategically and powerful, meaningful way. Second, Boyington himself is a complicated figure in the best possible sense. American military culture has a tendency to flatten war heroes into 2 dimensions, either the unimpeachable patriot or, in revisionist mode, the feet of clay expose. Boyington resists both. He was legitimately great at something. He was legitimately terrible at other things. He carried real damage from his experiences. He was a product of his time in some ways and a genuine original in others. He also, and I want to make sure this lands, was honest about his flaws in ways that many men of his generation just plainly were not. The memoir is not a flattering document. He didn't have to write it in that way, but he chose to. That takes a kind of courage that's different from aerial combat, but it's real courage nonetheless. And third, and this may be the thing I find most interesting, the Black Sheep story is really a story about what happens when you take the people nobody else wanted and you give them a mission and a leader who believes in them. Boyington didn't build this squadron from the best available talent and the best available material. He built it from the leftovers, and he told those leftovers, "You're not leftovers to me. You're just Black Sheep." And that identity, being the outsiders, the misfits, the ones who had something to prove, became a source of cohesion and pride rather than it did a source of shame. Now, this isn't a unique story, of course. Military history is full of all kinds of units that found identity in adversity, but there's something particular about the Black Sheep's origin story, assembled in 2 weeks from spare parts named after what they were accused of being, that really resonates with a lot of people. Plus, their commanding officer could get on the radio and challenge the entire Japanese Air Force to a fight, that's just kind of incredible. So, Gregory Pappy Boyington, VMF-214, the Black Sheep Squadron. He had 28 kills or 22, depending on who you ask, 1 Medal of Honor, 1 Navy Cross, 1 prison camp, 1 memoir that ticked off about half his former pilots, and a TV show that took considerable liberties, and 1 full life that was, by any reasonable measure, absolutely extraordinary, even, maybe especially, when it was a complete mess. Thanks for listening to Archives and Anchovies. I'm your host, James Coulon. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review if you're feeling generous, and tell a friend who also enjoys stories about chaotic geniuses in fighter planes, ice cream, presidents, different kinds of history, and just maybe some random topics. Who knows what I'm going to talk about in the next episode? Until then, try to be a little less Boyington in your personal life, but maybe a little more Boyington when it counts. As always, I wish you a wonderful day, a great evening, and a tremendous week ahead. Thank you.